Hello, welcome everybody online and of course in this room. I think many of you will know that Sunder Katwala is a very old friend of the centre. I think it must be at least 5 or 6 times that he's presented at centre events, lectures, conferences, and so on over the years. And he's written, I think, wisely and cogently on issues around integration and ethnic minorities and Britain. So when I learnt that he had actually put his thoughts together into a book-length production, a book, I thought, yes, we must definitely get him here. And so that's what we are going to be discussing. This is the book, quite a long title with a subtitle, How to Be a Patriot, Why Love of Country Can End Our Very British Culture War. So highly timely. And Sunder is doing lots of presentations all over the place. I'm probably getting a little bit fatigued by them. And that may be the reason that he's asked if instead of doing a long presentation, he could do a short presentation and then have a conversation with me to bring out some of the themes that we want to discuss. Certainly I will want to discuss. But then, of course, after that, in the usual way, we will be able to have a more participative discussion with those of you here and those of you who are online. So I won't say anything more about the book. I'll leave that for Sunder and for the rest of the session. But I will briefly say something about Sunder. And what I'll do is I'll nick what his publisher has said about him, which is this. Sunder Katwala was born in Doncaster to parents who'd come to Britain from Ireland and India to work for the NHS. He grew up in Cheshire and Essex before studying at the University of Oxford. Sunder has worked in journalism, publishing, and think tanks, including as a leader writer and internet editor for The Observer. He led the Fabian Society before founding the think tank British Future in 2012. Sunder is a regular contributor to the national broadcast and print media, including Radio 4's Today, Moral Maze, Newsnight, and more. He writes regularly for titles like The Guardian, New Statesman, Telegraph, Spectator, and more. In fact, one of your most regular columns now is in the Eastern Eye, so that's not mentioned by your publisher. So welcome, Sunder. Congratulations on your book. Tell us a bit about it.
Thanks very much. It's great to be with you virtually, and I really appreciate the invitation. It'd be great to have a conversation because I've learned a lot from your work personally and the work of your colleagues, and so be a chance to get interrogated on some of these themes, perhaps in a different way, some of the other things. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about why I wrote the book. It's a personal book about me, and it's a book about the country, and what I feel about it and what I think we should do about it. But I'm going to try and locate myself as well in the story of this country, modern multi-ethnic Britain, that we're all in. Because another thing I'm involved in at the moment is helping to coordinate and champion efforts to mark the 75th anniversary of Windrush, which we mark next week. So it's another auspicious reason to have this conversation today. And that's 3/4 of a century of this multi-ethnic Britain that we're all part of now. And I think trying to reflect on that broader context as well is one way to explain where I think I fit in, what my life experience says to me about the country, and also why it might differ a bit, I think, from people older than me and from people younger than me. And we might hear a bit of that today, because reflecting on those 3/4 of a century since the Windrush docked in Tilbury, which has now become a sort of symbolic origins moment of many things. I think the Black British presence, the Black Caribbean presence, the broader post-war Commonwealth migration from Asia as well, and of a multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multicultural Britain. The Windrush has become the symbolic starting point. Of course, it's the middle of a much longer story about Britain, about empire, about wartime service, about Commonwealth, and so on. It wasn't that well known as a story either, I think, for the first 4 decades after it arrived. It was famous at the time because the British Nationality Act was in Parliament when it was arriving, and so for that reason it had a level of notice. Pathé News were there with newsreel. It was on the front of the newspapers that the 2 boats that had come the year before did not have. And so it became, the third boat became the symbolic moment because immigration was a political issue at that time. But the reason it wasn't heard about much, I think, for 4 decades afterwards was that Black and Asian Britain didn't really have much public voice for those first few decades, and very much the subject of quite an intense public debate about migration and race in Britain, but in which the minorities were kind of the subjects of the debate, but not struggling to be part of it. I think at the start. So I would say that first quarter of century, 1948 to 1973, and I'm born in 1974, so I'm not part of this first story. It's the story of arrival, the contested story of arrival, but it's also a sort of, my dad arrives in this period. He arrives the week of the Enoch Powell Rivers of Blood speech, which clearly didn't get the coverage Enoch Powell might have wanted in Gujarat, because he came anyway. But it's a contested story of arrival, and of course, what ends the quarter century is Commonwealth free movement comes to an end. And so, what has been said in 1948, which is that everyone's welcome, come and rebuild Britain, we observe no colour bar in this great metropolitan empire of ours, is an invitation that when it's taken up, there are mixed feelings about that. So that first quarter century we now call the Windrush generation, specifically because it ends with, I suppose the immigration argument is for more closed, not as open as it was. The repatriation argument is lost by Powell and the Powellites. So the Commonwealth population is here and it's going to have children here too. And so Britain is going to become a modern multi-ethnic society that we are now, but it's a contested story. That second quarter century, I'm born, much to Enoch Powell's distress, in a hospital in Doncaster to my mum, who's come from Ireland, Cork. I'm brought up sort of Irish Catholic, really, but more obviously a bit Indian and a bit mixed race because I'm called Sunder Katwala. So I'm got different things going on. My dad remains, I think, culturally a Hindu while converting to Catholicism because the Catholics quite keen to get hold of the children normally. So he's a pragmatic bridger. I might have learned some bridging from him. But it's an interesting quarter century, I think, 1973 to 1998, because in my experience, if you go to school in this country in the 1980s, go to university in the early 90s, you go out into the professional world in the 1990s, I saw Britain open up for people like me. You were writing books, Tariq, Not Easy Being British, to collect your essays together in, I think, 1992. That's the year I'm going to university, and you're writing from the period in which it's not been easy to be British. But from Sunder Katwala's perspective, it got easier to be British quite a lot in exactly that period. And so I feel I saw a visible sense of progress in my country, and this makes me somewhat optimistic despite everything that has happened since. And for the Bristol School, I think you could call that period 73 to 98. You could call it the period of multicultural progress, really, because that debate is sort of starting, I suppose, with Roy Jenkins in the late 60s at the same time as Powell. But there is a presence in politics, finally, from 1987, a presence in professions, academia, law, up to a point, relatively thin, perhaps in terms of scale, a significant presence in music, culture and sport. And by the time we get to the 50th anniversary, that story starts to be told as well. And it's the 50th anniversary that really puts this Windrush moment on the map. Mike Phillips and Trevor Phillips produce a 4-part BBC TV series. So interesting, if you look at the publicity material now, it says it was an untold story. And it's not quite true it's an untold story. There would be publishers of Black memoirs, first generation memoirs, but probably niche publishers. And you'd have to go and look for it. And it would be known about in the University of Bristol, in other universities, but it was not, I think, famous to the society until that moment. And that is a story about the rise, I think, and the presence and the confidence of a multi-ethnic society in 1998. And I'm holding on, I think, personally, to that sense of progress, because I think in two ways I saw changes made for the better that we're not going to see reversed, whatever else happens. One was the decline of large, visible, overt racism at scale, which I experienced particularly because I was very keen to go and watch football matches when I was 7, 8, 9 and 10. Bit naive about the football terrace culture of the 1980s when I was badgering my dad. My friend Andrew had been allowed to go when he was 7. It took me 3 years to get to go to matches. And then by the time I'm 13 or 14, I might be thinking, well, I can see why this was a difficult battle to win, because while Everton Football Club, my team, were an exceptionally good team, they win the league twice in that era, which hasn't happened since I was 11. But they don't have any black players, which I don't know if I've noticed. Nobody's got any Asian players. But when Liverpool signed John Barnes, there's an iconic image then of Barnes backheeling a banana off the pitch at Goodison Park, where I've got my season ticket. And what the Everton fans are singing to taunt the Liverpool fans, they're singing Everton are white. Everton are white, because it's not that Everton should be jealous of the Liverpool having the England superstar John Barnes, it's that Liverpool should be jealous of Everton because they haven't got an all-white team and we have. So if you're Sunder Katwala in your tracksuit and top, you start to think, have I kind of picked the wrong thing here? But I'm invested. I'm in there, and football introduces me to anti-racism and the arguments about cricket. At the same time, Norman Tebbit, when I was 16, talked about the Tebbit test and so on. But I see those arguments go my way in terms of what the culture was in the football stadiums. The culture at Goodison Park, Everton, was massively different after 1994 than it had been in 1991. You were going to get thrown out if you were throwing bananas, if you were booing players. We signed a black centre forward, which helped, and so on. So I saw a shift that will stay. And younger people, I think, can reasonably say, well, we'll take that for granted. But monkey chanting and bananas, we're setting a low bar there. But it's important we saw it change, and I think we've seen it change in a powerful way. I took my 11-year-old to watch the England women's team, and you're just in a completely culturally different atmosphere there as to what the watching of international sport was like. And I personally felt a lot more confident about England as well as Britain in the summer of 1996 when I was 22, because there was obvious culture shift when England hosted that tournament. The St. George's flags came out, not the Union Jack. We've often debated what those symbols means, but they came out at a moment when there was a definite decision to have a celebratory culture, not a hostile, xenophobic culture, which had been dominant. So we thought that sport was going to be the sphere in which the most xenophobic aspects of national identity would find their expression, and they did in the 1980s, and by the 1990s that had flipped. But the other change I saw was this visibility and presence in public life, because I voted in the 1992 general election. I was 8 days old enough to vote in that election, and it was the second election with Black and Asian MPs. So six people were elected who are visible minorities out of 650, but I don't think they sat around on the BBC Election Nights programme to say what is the diversity deficit in our parliament. I don't particularly think it established itself as a theme. I think people probably have a false memory now that 1997 and New Labour must have seen a big breakthrough in that respect, because it did see a big breakthrough on gender and so on, but it didn't. We didn't really see a breakthrough until 2005, 2010 and so on. But that's another thing that's That's another thing that's staying. So, I graduate from university, there'd never been a Black or Asian government minister in this country. When Rishi Sunak is graduating from university, a few years later, there are no ethnic minority conservatives, and there's never been an Asian minister. So I don't know if he knows he can be prime minister, with all of his privilege. But, the change was quite rapid after that. And it's been a bit slower, I think, in, law and politics and business. It's been different academia in different spheres, but there's clearly a sense of progress. So I'm an optimist because of that second quarter about Britain opening up. So then the question becomes, what happened? And what I would say about the book is I'm not writing a book in 2022, 2023 about can Britain find a place for people like me? Because by the time I'm 18, 21, 25, it feels to me we've made a lot of progress there. It doesn't seem difficult to be British if you're mixed race, Irish, Catholic, Indian, British, Essex, Scouse kind of person that I am. The Britishness can combine that. What's worrying me is that we've got culture wars on every front. We've got a much more polarised debate about the future of the United Kingdom, about immigration, about integration, about faith, about politics. Brexit comes up, 9/11, 7/7 happens. And so I'm trying to work out what we think of that last quarter century. You could see it as a quarter century of retreat, of polarization. I think that case could be made, but it's a period of retreat and advance in different ways, because I think the shift in attitudes across generations has been profoundly strong and in a positive direction. And the argument between people for whom change feels too fast, for people for whom change also feels too slow, is really on in politics. And so what I think I'm trying to do in the book is say it's not much point Sunder Katwala having a confident sense of how national identity can work if it's only working for Sunder Katwala. Why is everyone else at loggerheads? And I think I try and look at 10 different identity crises, history, statues, identity, what we teach, who we are, migration, Brexit, faith, Scotland and the United Kingdom, and so on. And so it's hard in a book of 10 or 12 5,000 word pieces to try and sort them all out. But I'm interested in what we do with our approach to identity to try and get back on track, I suppose, and build more confidence that we can go somewhere. And the fourth quarter century of the first century after Windrush, well, that starts next week after the 75th anniversary. And what I would say is, if you think from 1948 to 73, or from 73 to 98, or from 1988 to 2023, societies can change enormously in a quarter of a century. And I'm interested in how we can get an argument, an agenda about what still needs to change on race and inclusion in Britain, where we could perhaps lift our sights a little bit to the society we think we could be in 2048. One thing British Futures just found in some research published in the last week is that with a representative sample of ethnic minorities as well as the general public generally, a very balanced view of race in Britain. People feel there's been quite a lot of progress and they feel there's a lot more to do. There's a really striking level of comparative confidence in Britain. We asked a very simple question: America, France, Germany and Britain, would you say we're doing better or worse if you had to choose? Ethnic minorities were 80-20 better, which is very striking. I think I give a lot of the credit to Donald Trump there. I think if President Obama was in, because I'm not sure how much we know about France, Germany and other countries, but I think President Trump can claim the landslide, but there's an underlying sense of confidence. And at the same time, 70% of ethnic minorities saying Black and Asian people in Britain face discrimination in their everyday lives, and there's much more to do. And a clear majority of the white majority are saying that's true as well. So a really balanced view that we've found. I think we have a more complex story about our society in terms of opportunities and outcomes for people of different groups. It got easier to be Irish Catholic. If people knew who I was, it got easier to be Indian, it got easier to be mixed race. It probably got harder to be Muslim. At the same time, it was getting easier to be Catholic when the IRA campaign was stopping and 9/11 was happening. I think the Black British perspective has been somewhat different from the British Asian perspective as well. There's a growing mixed group, but there are a lot of different experiences within it. So that's the challenge to myself and to the readers really, where can we go, and can we find a sense of confidence again? Because I used to feel confident about this country, and I still do, and I'd like more people to share it.
Great, thank you very much, Sunder. Thank you very much. I mean, there is a lot in your book. I very much enjoyed it, and I learned a lot about you. In fact, learned perhaps even more about you than I did about my country, but which in itself was very interesting. And the way that you weave your personal story across the generations, because your children have more than just a walk-in part as well, and why not so, because they are the future. The way that you weave that together with your general political thrust, as well as the historical account, which is very, very briefly summarized here, I think is very well done, with a nice light touch, and is very accessible. So I don't need to say that to an academic audience, but obviously you are hoping to have non-academic readers, and I'm sure you will get plenty. Some of the things in your book include things like discussion of the monarchy, cultural appropriation, Brexit, devolution, possible referendum in Scotland about independence, like the one we had in 2014, another one with perhaps slightly different terms of reference and so on. So it's a very rich book covering quite a wide political and cultural landscape. And no doubt some of these things we'll get into, either because of your answers or because of what people ask you. But what I want to do is to say something in what I'll say is a kind of the big picture terms. You yourself, without any coercion, you yourself mentioned at the very beginning the kinds of dialogue that you and I have had, and you with the Ethnicity Centre over the years. And my big picture comment, especially pointing to what one might call the theoretical ideas within which you are swimming, in which you are, as it were, telling your story, are really very multiculturalist in a way that a non-specialist reader of your book wouldn't know. So let me say what I mean here. So obviously, one thing you say, which listeners just now will see that it resonates with your presentation, though you didn't expressly say that except in your own autobiographical way, is that you say in the book that recognizing that most ethnic minority people, whether they be migrant first generation or their children or grandchildren and so on, aspired to be British in a way that a lot of people who saw themselves as the political champions of ethnic minorities in the 70s, 80s, and even the 90s, I think, just failed to appreciate, because they lacked the sensibility to see that's what people wanted. And that ethnic minorities coming to think of themselves as British, to be proud of being British, and to be accepted by co-citizens as British is one of the triumphs of multiculturalism, regardless of what we might say about its limitations and what people say. But what I want to say is actually, if we unpack that one triumph that you identify, it actually exists within a much larger set of layered ideas, theoretically and practically. For instance, I think that it's so clear that you do not think in terms of black and white. You think that minorities, and for that matter, even majorities, especially if we think about the national the multinational picture, you think minorities are a multi and can't be reduced to a form of racial dualism. You emphasize the importance of subjectivity. That's to say, what people think, who people want to be part of, their own sense of belonging, their aspiration to belong, and the importance of self-definition, whether it is Asians saying we're not Black, or your own children saying we're not mixed race, we're white, and you just shrugging your shoulders and saying, well, okay, all right, we'll have to rub out what I wrote on the census form and put in what you want put in. The importance, the very central importance of identity, not just socioeconomic location, not just various forms of political baggage and so on, but people's sense of identity. And the fact that inclusion, or integration, as some would say, isn't just about local identities or ethnic identities, but crucially about the national. And that integration is incomplete without this subjective identitarian sense of belonging, which will have to be pluralized for both sociological reasons and normative political reasons. So we have a plural sense of being British, and people can have not just hyphenated identities like your dad maybe, who thinks himself as British Indian or British Hindu, but can have multiple identities as perhaps your children do. I could go on a bit more, but that's probably a long enough list. So my first general point is that you are very practically focused, and rightly so, but you exist in an intellectual environment very much shaped by multiculturalism, which is supposed to have been a failed political project, but which you actually express in a very, as we've heard you say, optimistic way, and in a very fluent and confident way.
Yeah, it's a very well made point. I mean, in a way, if I use that, tale of three quarters model, then I think multiculturalism can claim in different forms, in different times, it can claim a lot of credit for the successes of that second quarter that are profoundly important to me. And in a way, then it's struggling, but we're all struggling with the challenges that arise then in the era of contestation and polarization, because in a sense, multiculturalism that's trying to be this new frame for a confident nation becomes one of the poles in the debate, depending on what we're doing with the for and against multiculturalism debate. But by 2000, when the Prague report comes out, it reinforces, and there's lots of different stories, and you would know a lot about that from the inside, about the way in which that gets beaten up a bit, and that's coming after the Macpherson report and the Lawrence inquiry, which again, for lots of reasons I talk about this in the book, that's a really important moment for people my age. I was the same age as Stephen Lawrence. That was sort of also a bit of a shocking moment for me, that maybe my confidence in Britain is pretty contingent on who you meet if you're trying to catch a bus, so that's a really important moment when, I suppose, to a certain extent, Middle England, partly because the intervention of the Daily Mail is seeing something that Black British people have been trying to say and have not been heard saying, seeing it anew, and suddenly everybody's shocked, and we have a moment of kind of progress. But then we have a lot of challenges. I'm becoming skeptical of multiculturalism. In a way, I really want to say this point, which I think is always there in Britain, and it's a really interesting question in comparative context. Why do British minorities have such a strong stake and claim in Britishness? And it's something to do with empire and Commonwealth, but there are other post-imperial societies in Europe, France and Belgium, and so on, and it plays out differently. And what seems to happen in Britain is that when it's rejected, you double down on it. and you say to someone saying, why are you here and who let you in? You say, you should know your history. We are your history. Why don't you know your history? And this is one of the things I say in the book. You know, my parents are from India and Ireland, and they've come to work there. And it's, of course, I'm British. What's your credential to be British? I mean, I can only be British. Where are you on that? And Englishness might be tougher than that, Scottish, but there's an openness to Britishness, but also a confidence. And the academic studies always find just a little bit more attachment, and no doubt that's part of the story of it being questioned and challenged. And there's a complexity to that, but it should stop being surprising once it's true, decade after decade, that it happens to be the case. And as you say, the liberal left's somewhat surprised by that, because if you've always been confident about the passport you hold and the identity you've got, you can sort of evolve beyond it and think that's a very sort of cosmopolitan and superior thing to do. But actually, British minorities have doubled down on it, I think, despite the challenges. So that's a real gain. Three or four things go wrong. I think there are different multiculturalisms, and the Bristol schools and yours, I can very much converge with what you're trying to do, because you're interested in all the challenges that are there. For me, I'm very liberal by instinct. Maybe I'm liberal by interest as well. If you're sort of mixed race, Indian, Irish, lapsed Catholic, agnostic, then if it gets to being a groups thing, you're going to have quite a small group. So you need it not to be too groupy. So I might be group skeptic for that reason. I think it was too much about faith, and I think it's important to do multi-faithism. And we've now got a multiculturalist king who is very much a multi-faithist, multiculturalist king. So at time it's gone out of fashion, we've got King Charles back as a multiculturalist. It was too much about faith because there was no ethnic diversity anywhere else in public life. So you had to go to the temples and the gurdwaras and the mosques and say, can we talk, and so on. But there was a naivety, I think, from national government and local government about the internal dynamics by gender and generation of the groups they were talking to. And I think for too long, while people from minority backgrounds do have a stronger sense of faith than the white British, I think for too long it was getting good faith relations right is really important, but it was almost like minorities are minority faith communities. So the boxes are too neat and tidy. And that's obviously obvious if you're mixed race or if you're, Indian, Irish, Catholic, and so on. But it'll be a larger group for whom the boxes are a bit neat and tidy. But there's also the right to exit and the right to sort of be in between and so on, which I'm sure is reflected in principle. But a community of community multiculturalism would be a bit skeptical there. And then I think while the project is to reshape the national identity, I don't know if the majority know that. And I think the majority think multiculturalism is, the minorities for the minorities, about the minorities. You haven't been here very long. Let's help you get on, find out the rules of the road, and so on. And that's migrants come and integrate in that way. For the children of migrants, that starts to get a bit annoying. People are saying, why am I integrating? What's going on? And so I think there's an underestimation from everybody, including sort of liberal multiculturalists and others, where we assume that the majority knows what it is and will have to help the minorities with their identity. And so a lot of this comes down to the relationships between majority and minority identities for everybody. And that is your multiculturalist project. But I think a lot of people who would think of themselves as multiculturalists, perhaps on the political left and on the liberal left, haven't really got a story about the majority group. To some extent, I would go to national identity as the thing to work out, the shared citizenship, the common citizenship. If we don't do that, I think it's reasonably natural to get a sort of Trumpist backlash, where if everyone's going to assert the interests, identities, and recognition of their group and work out if they get a fair share of the pie, then I think it wouldn't be surprising if a white majority group that's getting smaller but is still a majority decides it needs a group identity and a group interest. And I don't particularly want a white majority group politics. I want a sort of shared civic national identity that people who've been here 17 generations, people who've been here 2 generations and are arriving can share. So those are the challenges that I think multiculturalism faced by the end of the century. I think once demands were being made about faith recognition as well as ethnic recognition and so on, it got choppier. Clearly, Islam becomes a more polarized debate as well, although I think the intensity of that has gone. So that's why I'm a bit of a fence sitter about it, because I think we got to the point where by sort of the Cameron era, the politicians are against multiculturalism in a caricatured form. It's about incentivizing segregation. It's about promoting separateness. We need to work on what we share together, which I agree with. Whereas other people, I think the minority view largely was multiculturalism is recognition and it's about doing more things together. But we always had a sort of left versus right standoff about the word when we needed to get on to the agenda for change. We haven't decided what we're replacing it with, and that might be part of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say multiculturalism may be about rethinking the national identity, including, of course, the majority's place within it. But the majority don't know that yet. You will, I'm sure, be aware, and I think there is a reference to it in your book, that the Tariq report, the report of the Commission on Multi-Ethnic Britain that came out in 2000, caused hysteria amongst some newspapers like the Telegraph and the Mail and others of that ilk, because they said, who are these uppity ethnic minority academics and activists telling British people what it means to be British? So certainly that week, a lot of people did register that multiculturalism was a project about collectively rethinking what it means to be British. And that could be painful because there would be contesting views, including challenging some received views, challenging them because they were either false or exclusionary, supremacist, or all three. But let me, if we leave the multiculturalism out for a moment, another thing that kind of puzzles me a little bit about your book is your attachment to the term patriotism. So you describe your position as a kind of civic patriotism. I describe my position as a multicultural nationalism. So we've had a little to and fro about the multicultural, but what about the patriotism versus nationalism? So I would say that why I think patriotism is too weak an idea to bring a country together, and therefore we need a term like nationalism, though I can see that nationalism will also be misunderstood by so many people, just as multiculturalism is. So if you like, I'm trying to rectify two misunderstandings by taking the two misunderstood words and creating what some people think is an oxymoron. But when we talk about the national, we know we have a certain amount of historical depth that we have to engage with, whether it is through rethinking it, whether it is through getting rid of those parts that are no longer fitting a story about ourselves to tell it to each other now and to our children and the next generation and so on. But it is about a sense that something exists which is bigger than us, and that we're, as it were, we become part of that story in the way that you and your family have become part of that story, from India, Ireland, and Liverpool and Essex, and so on. And patriotism really doesn't carry that kind of historical weight, or if you like, even identitarian weight. For a lot of people, patriotism can be associated with some landscapes, oh, I'm very fond of the Jurassic coast in Devon. I feel very English when I walk over those cliffs. I mean, that's not enough to sustain a sense of multicultural Britishness. So we need something stronger and something that connects to our state institutions, which we're both trying to reform and asking them to play a leading role in the crafting of multicultural Britishness and bringing people together with a sense of belonging and equality. So for these kinds of reasons, patriotism is just, I think, too lightweight a term.
That's I mean, that's a really unusual critique, because the critique I'm getting the rest of the time is that it might be too much, rather than that, especially from the more liberal left, that part of the market. I think this sort of is not enough argument. You'd think this will come from the right, and from a more, maybe assimilationist and traditionalist view of what the nationalism was. So there's a lot of nationalism bad, patriotism good writing. There's a lot of ethnic bad, civic good. And I mean, these, broadly, obviously we want to make some distinctions, and the ethnic civic one is clearly a necessary one for our diverse societies. I think it's just worth us digging beneath and saying, if, for example, for people who think it's too much, am I asking too much? I mean, it's a liberal democracy, so there's going to be no sort of marching you around in classrooms and so on. I mean, the communitarianism we can get, which I want at a national level, as a local level, it's going to be voluntary, really, whether it's the monarchy or whether it's sport or anything else. So you need some of these overlapping things. And if some people love the landscape and other people like football and other people for Eurovision Song Contest, as long as we get to do things together in a diverse society, that will help. But yes, it's also about shared citizenship. So it's going to be about political institutions that give us a sense that we've got an equal voice and that's meaningful and they work and so on. And at some level, it is about, the things that Ofsted send around to schools and that prime ministers make speeches about, respecting other people's freedom of speech and so on. Now, what I think the weakness, which is where I'm on the same side as you, whatever we call the labels, the weakness of the civic inclusive project is that it's very often just trying to take things out in case the things we leave in are too exclusive. So it says, British values, don't tell me about British values. I'm sure they've got values in Peru as well. Are you saying they don't have values in Peru? And also, aren't the values in a liberal democracy going to end up being the rule of law and freedom of speech and, respect for free speech of other people and democracy and, no violence and so on? So which the answer is broadly yes, but that is, I think, missing the point. In two ways. One is I think it's taking out things it doesn't need to, which I'll come back to. But secondly, Canada and France and Britain and America and Italy and Germany, they're going to make different decisions as large, diverse liberal democracies. That Britain and France are always going to do different things about faith and different things about race and ethnicity because they've got different traditions. And even if we end up in the same kind of place, and very much like to see Belgium have this kind of idea of Belgianness and Europeanness, one day for people of different backgrounds in Belgium. Maybe that's emerging, or maybe it isn't. But we will have a very British story about how we got there. And we can, if people know some of their history, we can get religious tolerance having tried the opposite in the civil wars and so on. We can get the story of Windrush and so on as how it works and so on. And other people have a different story with different myths, different moments, different experiences, different stories. So I'm for leaving more in, but what we leave in will have to be contestable. The history, we should keep the history, we should keep a canon of literature and language and song and let people write the next chapters and let them interrogate the history and say, you've left this bit out because, the Windrush obviously is a voluntary migration story of people who pay £28. So it's very important and not particularly known perhaps or thought about that. So that part of the story starts with voluntary economic migration of people choosing to get on a boat because they found the money. That's a different origin story to American slavery. Doesn't mean that slavery isn't in the British story as well, but it's playing a different role in the story. And if you don't know that, you end up sort of, which I think we were doing 30 years ago, sort of starting to teach sort of American race history, which is really important, as if it was our own history. So I'm for the thicker version. I think people misunderstand you if you use nationalism. The Scottish National Party is called National, but wants to be not nationalist at all, although obviously it works because it's got the word national in it, but it wants to be very cosmopolitan. But I think we need to dig into what is it too much to demand in a liberal society, and what is it important and necessary to demand. And what I think the civic, inclusive, liberal instinct to take things out is it's never really understanding the possible loss of taking things out. And just, to go back to that Biko Parek moment, I think to some extent you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and certain people are deciding to have a backlash. To a certain extent, I think avoidable mistakes are made in the way the case is put, because it sounds like, you know, and what we could say is the Union Jack has stood for service and sacrifice across the Commonwealth, and it stood for an empire as well, but we can reclaim it. It sounds like it's saying, you know, maybe you need a new flag, maybe you'll need a new country, maybe you'll need a new name, instead of saying we need to work with the symbols to make sure they're inclusive. So that's where I think the backlash comes from, the taking things away to making things inclusive. Whereas if you write more chapters, I want to put up more statues. I mean, I'd take down, you know, that one famous statue in Bristol, you know, within the law. But I haven't got a big list of things I'm taking down. I've probably got a big list of things I'd like to put up. And if people who want to retain and explain, to use the government phrase, they won't let you get onto the explaining, or they won't put anything up as well, then that's a different point. But it's reasonable to say, don't go and sort of interrogate every statue in every city and spend our time doing that.
Thank you. And taking down statues or not taking down statues is, of course, a very Bristol point, as you just observed. So maybe that's a good moment to allow Bristolians to come in, and for that matter, people online. I'll begin with allowing people who I can see in front of me to first raise questions. And of course, you could raise questions about things that have been said so far, that have not been said. If you've had a chance to look at the book, anything you want to ask about what you read. And if you haven't had a chance to look at the book, obviously feel free to ask what, you know, whether there are certain things that you're interested in are or are not covered in the book, and if they're not, why not? Yes, Catherine.
Hi.
Say who you are. They can't see you, but they'll hear you.
Catherine Charsley in sociology here in Bristol. Thank you very much. I haven't read the book, but I'm looking forward to. It's got a big promise on the cover. It says, how love of country can end our very British culture wars. And so I was looking out for that, what the solution to the culture wars is. And so I think I heard you say that the solution is an inclusive British identity. And then I was racking my brains because I can't remember what the name of the author of the study was, but I remember reading about how, as Britain, some empirical research that suggested as Britishness became portrayed as more inclusive, some people retreated away from Britishness and towards Englishness precisely because they wanted a more exclusive identity. So I wondered whether inclusive-ness is actually going to end the culture wars. I love your prescription for how we end the culture wars, but I wondered if, have I summarized correctly what you think it is? And how do you respond to that? That there seems to be empirical evidence that some people are really turned off by inclusive British identities and would rather call themselves English because that is more exclusive.
Great questions. On the second one, broadly, no, I think is a good answer to the second one, although I can see why people think that, because in the end, across the generations, Britishness and Englishness have both got more inclusive over time, and the Britishness inclusiveness is heading towards 90 and 97% in terms of strict rejection. There's some complexity in how you ask these questions, and Englishness surprisingly has gone with it with a lag effect. There's a lag effect, it's not often observed this, but a lag effect because it's quite unusual for migrants to think they can be English. And it's very easy for migrants to be British, but it turned out to be much easier than people thought for the children of migrants of different ethnic backgrounds to feel that both things were open, and Scottishness and Welshness and Englishness could all do that. So something else happens with Englishness, which is more the question you're asking, I think, which is that at the same time it's becoming broader, that basically British-born people from minority backgrounds can identify it as well, might be more British than English. I felt that for a while, then I felt equally both, etc. So it's broadening, and 90% of the majority think it can broaden as well. But at the same time, the political Englishness that's being mobilised using British icons, actually, in the Brexit referendum and so on. So the Boris Johnsons, the Nigel Farages, they're appealing to a certain version of Englishness, but they're not doing it explicitly through Englishness most of the time. You know, the English Defence League is, but the British National Party is the other. The intense mobilisation of the people who feel very strongly English, not British, you know, get rid of Scotland, more English than British. That is driving the politics of Brexit and so on. But two different things are happening. Across the generations, more people are becoming English. That group is prioritising its Englishness. It turned out not to want Scotland to just get lost because we don't want to pay for it once Scotland was having a referendum and so on. So it's softer than we think. So it's a risk, but on the whole, it doesn't seem to be a big thing that people are saying, well, if the minorities have got Britishness now, stuff that I'm English, send them back. That doesn't quite seem to hold up over time. Some people might be doing that. Bigger question, how do I sort out the culture wars? I don't actually have a plan to totally call off the culture wars. And I also didn't want to end the book with, if everyone listens to Sunder, Katwala, here's a 10-point plan, everyone stop being silly and it'll all be fine and I've got all the answers, because it's more complicated than that. I have a little sort of modest 5-point plan in the sort of penultimate chapter, but I didn't put it last. I just here are some pointers. And the reason I don't totally have a plan, although publishers are very keen on, how to patriot and call off the culture wars, but I would like us to work on it, is that everyone knows how to call off the culture wars. Everyone knows that the way to call off the culture wars is for the people who don't agree with them to shut up and pipe down. And that is an extremely popular prescription among Guardian readers, Telegraph readers, and everybody. That if you go to a Labour Party conference, everyone say, why are the Tories fighting culture wars? The Conservatives are really discombobulated that the left thinks the right starts the culture wars, and the ditto on the left, because they'll say, Dominic Cummings is sitting in Downing Street saying, let's do some more trans stuff in the newspapers. You can see them doing it. And the right is saying, you want to take down a statue, throw it in the river, the police will say, well done, the court will acquit you. We say, is that a good idea? And we're the culture warriors. So the right is discombobulated that the left thinks there's a culture war. So there's a problem here while you've got that. And the British culture war is actually slightly subtler, I say, than the French and American ones. The French and American ones are more full-on debates about the substance. The British culture war is often an attempt to prove that the other side is the culture warrior, really, and that you're the reasonable people and that they are the culture warriors. And it's a sort of jiu-jitsu dance of kind of, and so this is, it's quite complicated as to what is going on, but there's a real subjective perception that I am reasonable, you go a bit too far, she is an incorrigible culture warrior. And so culture war is, in a sense, a contested term. That has a really big implication, which is that if you really want to call off the culture wars, you've got to think about what your team, your tribe, people who think like you are willing to do or change, even sacrifice, to take the heat out a bit. And now that sounds really difficult, because you'll think, well, unilateral disarmament, I'm not disarming, what about them? But also you'll think, Sunder, I don't want to stop doing anti-racism and climate change and gay rights and trans rights. I mean, these are good causes. I'm not, so that isn't obviously what I want people to do, sacrifice their commitment to causes. I want people to think about the boundaries, the tones, but it's always good party politics, civic society politics. It's always fine to, challenge the people on the other side who go too far. It's very easy, it's fun. When people are shocked, they're not really shocked. They're really pleased that they've got something to prove what they're all really like. And it's much harder to do it on your own side. You're only making a contribution, I think, to the political culture when you're applying to your own teams, tribes and sides similar-ish standards to the ones you call out the opposition for. That's why I've ended up on that. How you have a culture that does that or doesn't do that, because if you get into a world where, because of the internet, or because we've got the shouty newspapers, or because Brexit was a stupid mistake, or because Brexit was ignored when it was a brilliant democratic idea, you start to say, well, I'd stop it, but they won't stop it, so I'd better play the game as it's now played. And that's where you institutionalize in Britain a more polarized dynamic that I think is stronger in America than Britain. So I'm interested then in how you institutionalize not doing that. And here are two big things I would do. I would really defend the BBC and try and keep it. So if you want to look at American and British dynamics, there are lots of things going on, but all sorts of people watch the BBC when a pandemic happens, or if there's a terrible event, as there's just been in Nottingham. People watch other channels, well, everyone's watching the BBC. And we haven't got the situation where 35% of the country and 35% of the country, if something terrible happens, just get a totally parallel narrative from CNN or Fox News. So I want to protect that. But because I want to protect that, I want to protect that as a broad space that we share. So I don't particularly want a sort of progressive campaign to save the BBC from the evil Tories, because that's almost starting from the position I don't want to end up in, which is that it belongs to one of the cultural tribes and isn't a point across them. So I'd like Conservatives to think about the value of the BBC because of the monarchy and the proms and so on in the World Service, etc. And I'd like the BBC to just be careful about doing that. So if we keep that, that's really good. And then the other thing that really matters is sort of the level and quality of meaningful social relationships between people of different backgrounds and groups in our everyday lives, you know, from a very young age. And schools can do a lot about that, universities can do a lot about that, and so on. And so that's, you know, there's another set of things we could do. My general view is Britain has done quite well in this. This was the success of multiculturalism in the period when it was going on. Britain's done quite well at this without ever doing it very actively, and without the government ever really having an idea about what its role is and what the role is of other institutions. So my kind of point then is that every institution has a relevant part to play, and the role of a school or a university or a faith group or a sports team will be different. But that, especially if politics gets more polarised, we've got to think about where are the spaces of meaningful dialogue, meaningful contact, meaningful relationships with people who you're not instinctively a kind of I'm like them, I'm with them view, either because of your characteristics or because of your political views. So I haven't got a total plan, but I've got some things we could all try and get on with.
Thank you. You happy with that, Catherine?
Yes, thanks.
Okay, maybe take another question from the room if there is one. Otherwise, we'll go online next. Yeah, go ahead, Joe. Introduce yourself, please.
Sure. My name's Jo Haynes. I'm a sociologist in the school. Thank you very much for summarising your book. I haven't read it yet, but I will. Maybe I can borrow Tariq's version there. And thanks, Tariq, for the dialogue. But I just wanted to find out whether you actually said anything about education in the book, and if so, was that an optimistic narrative? Because I did some research in the early 2000s in relation to ethnic minority achievement, and the story then was pretty grim. There was some variation, of course, depending on what ethnic minority group you identified with. But since then, I think that there has been subsequent studies that show nothing much has changed. If anything, it's possibly got worse. So I wonder if your story about education is similarly optimistic, and if so, why?
Sure, it's not something I do a great deal in the book, but I have got a view about it that is slightly different to the picture you've presented that I've touched on a little bit and have talked about elsewhere. What is in the book about education is more about this. I mean, the two things going on, I think, to get a sort of inclusive society and integrated inclusive society in the best sense, you need to work really hard on, you know, the hard facts of socioeconomic equality, of which educational opportunity is one key issue, not the only one, of course. And you need a parallel agenda that I think is a bit fuzzier around, you know, equality of status, quality of mutual recognition, and so on. I think if you're doing both of those things, it can work. If you're preaching kind of flags on town halls, etc., but you haven't got an agenda for socioeconomic equality, I think it doesn't really work. And I think to some extent that is the weakness of the French model, while the French think that the British are sort of absurdly sort of laissez-faire, multiculturalist and so on. But by not having, you know, ethnicity data and so on in France, they can find out what's going on in the pandemic, what's going on in education and jobs. They are making it extremely difficult to deal with one of the really two big points. The education story in Britain for minorities generally got a lot better, I think. Part of that is a very specific London story, although it's not only a London story, a post-1997 London story. But you've got to the point where, and there are left behind groups of different kinds, and, you know, people from a traveller background are, you know, struggling a lot more than other groups. There are specific parts of groups of white boys from working class background, black boys from working class background who were, you know, still not there. The progress among girls of different minority backgrounds, including some of those that were doing, you know, that were lagging, has been extraordinary. Girls from Pakistani and Bangladeshi backgrounds, but overall in the aggregate, if you're a British person from a visible minority background, black, Asian, mixed race, you're a bit more likely to be a graduate than a white Briton. Some of that is an age demographic, but if we just take the cohort of 18-year-olds and so on, you're more likely year on year to be going off into higher education. Now, so there's an optimistic story for sure in that the aggregate gap has gone, and that there's a lot of complexity that is, some of it's class and some of it's other things, because some of it really isn't class. You know, if you Chinese results on free school meals are incredibly strong, and you know it varies a lot. But the gender progress has been very, very strong, particularly in minority groups, and the male story is slightly different to the female story. But the aggregate gap has closed, so there's a real complexity then of working out what to do and who still needs help. Two things then to temper the optimism. One is that the story of what then happens at universities looks trickier, and I'm not a total expert on this. I'm sure some people in the room probably are. And you know, the different choices going on. Some people study closer to home for lots of good reasons, but you know, and then so the progression in university can be a challenge, and we need really good auditing of that institution by institution and find out what's going on. And then the real gap, which is troubling, is that where the educational gaps have closed, the labour market gaps have not closed in the way that they should to match the educational gap. So the Black British unemployment rate is really mysterious if you look at the geography of Black Britain, which is half in London, and the educational profile of Black Britain, because it's just much too high among graduates. And then it might also be high among groups that have done badly in education, but that is a different story. And the biggest challenge and the biggest agenda I would pick as well is what I would call just the fairness test, which is that, you know, if you send your CV in and it's got an identifiably minority name, it's a point I've made to my daughter. Her name is Zarina Katwala, and she does tick the white British box. And I go through this in the mixed race chapter, where she explains why she's done that, because she's an ally of anti-racism, but she's given white privilege most of the time because she visibly, you know, appears white to other people. I said to her, you know, Zarina Katwala, you still got skin in the game in the CV fairness test, so you know you're still on the team that, you know, benefits directly if we sort that out. But the academic studies there are remarkably stubborn actually over time. For all of the attitudinal progress we see, the ethnic penalty in recruitment and progression seems quite strong. So I think my overall story is a significant amount of progress in education, you know, with some gaps in complexity, and then challenges in higher education and in jobs about seeing that come off. And I no doubt educational specialists could then point to, you know, complexities in that story. But it does mean that if you're for fair chances for everyone and no unfair barriers for anyone, my own instinct is you've got to take a very similar view to a Black British boy who, for various characteristics, might struggle and might need support, and a white British boy who's in that position, or person from a traveller background. And I think if we could get to that position, we would diffuse quite a lot of the class versus race politics which comes up. What is frustrating about race versus class as a competing grievance issue is there are lots of voices in the public debate who mention class while race and gender is being mentioned, but never stay around to keep talking about class. If you stop and say, okay, let's talk about class, then it's only really being used as a block and a complication why it's not time to do more on gender or race. And if you step back and said, let's integrate our approaches to class and race and gender, I think you could call out the sincerity of that and find out who is sincere about it. And that's where I think the work is.
Yeah, I mean, it's widely observed that the pandemic helped to bring out some of the structural racial inequalities in Britain. So I think there's a parallel which you were referring to, which is that the ethnic minority educational success has actually helped to highlight the inequalities in the labour market, which we otherwise wouldn't see to such an extent. And we do to such an extent simply because ethnic minorities are doing so well in competing for jobs, which they're not then getting. Doing so well in terms of, you know, qualifications and so on. Maybe we will have some questions from the online people. Now, Jamil, you put something in the chat. Would you like to make yourself visible and ask it directly? Yeah, go ahead, Jamil.
Hi, thank you, Sunder, and thank you, Tariq, for this session. So I work on data and analysis of the census, and very much involved at the moment looking at the faith and religion and ethnicity data. And there has been this question on identity in the census, and it's always been not very well defined what the census means by in asking that question. But the responses are quite interesting. In the most recent census, there's a higher proportion of Muslims indicating their main identity is British compared to other faith groups, but in other faith groups, excluding, of course, the majority Christian and the Jewish faith group. But why do you think Muslims have responded to a greater proportion to this question in saying that 75% feel that British is their main identity compared to, say, Hindus, where I think it's 10 points lower?
Yeah.
Any views? Thank you.
My instinct about the Muslim findings, and this comes out in other research where different South Asian groups, Pakistani and Bangladeshi groups are answering and get very high Britishness scores. About 2/3 of the Muslim group is South Asian. It's obviously a more plural group in different ways. The British scores are high because it is the group that has felt its Britishness is under pressure, under challenge, and under scrutiny in this generation. And I think what we've seen from British Muslims, mostly post 9/11, post 7/7, has been in a way a playing out of that dynamic we saw with Black Britons in the Windrush moment and across the generations, is that when the identity is put into question, instead of a retreat from it, if you don't want me, then maybe I'm not, I'll choose something else, has been a doubling down on it. I think that is an explanation of the high score. I think the Hindu score could be higher. Now, just another caveat: the national identity findings in the census we should take with a pinch of salt, and we've now got a good example of why we should, because this is a country, and this is a useful point to your multiculturalist project in Bristol as well. We've got proof really that most people in the United Kingdom identify with more than one national identity and more than one flag, and that includes the English-British majority who didn't realise they did that. The Scottish British, if you are, and the Welsh British did that, and minorities did that. But we live in a multinational union of overlapping national identities, the citizenship identity that's shared and other identities. On the census, most people tick one box, even if they have plural identities. And then there was a methodological change between the 2011 and the 2021 census, which is that in 2011, English was first on the list, and British, I think, was about fourth. And 7 out of 10 people ticked English only. The white English did that. And the people who ticked British were largely the ethnic and faith minorities. This time, and I think the British government probably nudged the ONS to do this, they put British top in England. They couldn't put British top in Scotland and Wales because the Scottish and Welsh governments control it. And you've got the absolute reverse of the results. And I don't think that, I think that just shows you that question order matters, and that if people are ticking one box, they will tick the first box that reflects an identity that is relevant to them. And then some people will think about, by the way, you're allowed to tick multiple boxes in this. It's just that relatively few respondents chose to do so. Everything else you do with people, if you ask them, are you both equally, are you more British than English, are you more, every other way you answer the question, people say they've got both. But when they're ticking a form which has got 40 boxes to tick, they tend to, we're asking more of a pick the biggest one, but they're picking the one that's listed first primarily. And so there's been a massive swing to Britishness over Englishness between the 2011-2021 census, but the main reason is that they changed the order. It makes, by the way, the minority-majority answers much more similar this time than last time, but not, for when it wasn't the top answer, ethnic minorities found it on the list last time, so they clearly identified with it in a different way. So that's why it's a slightly crude snapshot, I think, and we've only had it for 2 censuses.
Thank you.
I just had a follow-up on that, if you don't mind. Can I go ahead?
Yes, please do, Jamil.
So, Sunder, So, okay, your argument is that it's a defensive response by the Muslims, but I think there's another explanation. I think it's you see, the other bits of census tell us that now the majority of Muslims are British born.
Yeah.
So I think it could also be a generational difference,
Yeah.
as opposed to a defensive reaction. So it could be
Yeah.
something much more proactive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's that's an interesting point. And the Muslim group obviously has a younger demographic and so on. So that is a very plausible hypothesis. I think what we see in the long term, and you know, the ethnic minority British lecture study showed this, is that the first generation of migrants had extremely strong migrant optimism in Britain, particularly around very high trust in political institutions, and that might be driven by things like, you're the migrants, you made the choice. It might be driven by what is your point of comparison and so on. And then you see an integration effect on mistrust of democracy, disaffection for British-born minorities, in that they start to go a bit more towards everyone else who isn't quite as optimistic about British institutions and so on. But on the identity questions, it might be doing something different. I've always felt that's particularly important around the accessibility of English identity, that the half of minorities that are English and British born find it very easy to think about Englishness, whereas for a lot of the migrant group, it's not relevant to them in the same way. But Britishness has been open to the migrant and the British born, but you might be right that it might become more strongly so for some people.
Thank you.
Emil, would your point work as a comparative point in the way that you initially raised it in the chat? If Muslims, 75% Muslims are just choosing British because they were born in Britain, why should that work differently for Hindus?
Yeah, I think so. I think a lot of the recent migration has been of young Hindus because of the work permit relaxations.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't know the numbers. What I would say is that I'm aware that quite a lot of Muslims, relative to other groups, are not born in Britain. I mean, the majority of Muslims are born in Britain,
Yeah.
but the proportion of Muslims not born in Britain, for instance, is more than the proportion of Sikhs not born in Britain. I don't know the precise figures for any group, including Hindus, but anyway, certainly people asserting certain identities, and not all minority groups assert identities in the same way. We first learned of that when we saw, you know, across the period of time that Sunder's been talking about, the color was so much more important to some minorities, religion to others, continental background like Asian to others, and so on. And it's so Muslims and Hindus may be thinking about British versus English together or separately, i.e. jointly British and English or only British. They may be thinking about it separately. I don't know.
I think this question illuminates something really important, that we've kind of used, you know, foreign-born, UK-born as a broad generational thing. But actually, I really think we might now want to look at foreign-born first generation way back when and foreign-born last 5 years. And that might be a really useful thing to unpick, because as you were saying, but the post-Brexit immigration story is net zero EU migration now, a much higher new non-EU migration, a lot of it from India, a lot of it from Nigeria, and so on. And therefore, if we're using, you know, our instincts about what we're looking at when we look at born abroad, born here, you know, will change. And I think one of the things that's happened with community relationships, you take some of the issues that in Leicester in the last 6 months, is that there's a shared experience of the last 30 or 40 years in Leicester that was held across communities, but there'll be new groups who don't know that story and weren't part of that story. And that therefore gives you a new integration challenge of a different shape from the one that you were thinking about in the past.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, if you don't mind, if you look at the Arab ethnic group, which is now available, so they have a lower response to the identity question compared to the I mean, and of course, Arab, it could be a proxy for Muslim, because I think 84% of the Arabs would be Muslim. So again, that comes back to the generational difference. Maybe the Arab population is more first generation compared to the Asian born here.
Yes, so something's occurred to me is I think the British race discourse is very distinctive from other ones in Europe and from America's in different ways. But I think it makes a lot of sense if you are from a Black or Asian Commonwealth background. And I think a lot of the discourse doesn't particularly make that much sense to large non-Commonwealth groups. And so in a way, I think the British Chinese group is somewhat invisible in these debates because it doesn't associate with the way we tell the story as much. And then there are going to be, 3 or 4 large new groups now, might be people from the Middle East, people of Arab origin, West Europeans, Central Europeans and East Europeans are here in large numbers now as settled migrants. Will this story of it's easy to become British apply as easily to children of, it was true of the children of Hungarians and the children of Poles in the 1950s, but for the post-Brexit group, does it apply as easily, or are we being a bit lazy? If you're a Hong Konger, which is another big group, you might start with a very high sense of British identity because of why you're coming. So I think to some extent we might be a little bit complacent about the effectiveness of the offer of identity because it worked for the large Commonwealth groups, and it might be a bit of a test, I think. And we've now got 3 or 4 million permanent settled residents who won't have the right to vote because they're the post-Brexit Europeans. And then that's a new question, I think, that is slightly off the radar. So that white other group, which tends to be just think of it as an asterisk, it's actually a really important group, I think, for the integration debate of the next decade.
Thank you.
Yeah. Tim has a question. Please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tim Fowler in politics. Thanks so much for the talk. I also look forward to reading the book. I'm going to do something you said not to do, which is compare Britain to America, but just as a way of being slightly skeptical of this idea that patriotism can be like the answer to the culture wars. So America is a very overtly patriotic, famously much more overtly patriotic than Britain. I assume that the number of migrants who have, children of migrants who have an American identity is as high or higher than here, and yet it's utterly broken by the culture wars in which we hope isn't here. So at least there, this kind of shared patriotic identity coexists with kind of deep divisions over how to interpret that identity, or just you can fight about everything else, even though you're shared in America. So what gives you the optimism that even if we could make these people identify as British, it would thereby provide a solution to these other points of disagreement?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, in a way, what I'm saying about, and it's not so much the patriotism so much as the openness of the identity and the attractiveness of the identity in a way. I'm saying that if you want the migration debate, if you want confidence in migration, the anti-migration argument has this shape always. The anti-minority argument, the populist argument always has the shape, too many of them. They're taking our stuff, jobs, houses, might be other things. They don't like us, they don't want to be us, they're not like us. And we're not even allowed to talk about it, or the elites will close us down. And working your way through that, I talk quite a lot about this. There's a sort of, I don't want to talk about that, that's a horrible conversation. And there's a, who needs a sense of us in a newly globalized cosmopolitan world kind of response, which obviously works for all the people who weren't attracted at all by that story, but is tending to confirm it. And then where a lot of liberals end up is they end up in sort of they are good for us arguments. What about the NHS and the fruit needs picking? And what I want to say about they are good for us arguments is it's true that once you've got control of your immigration, you've got to decide if you want people to pick fruit and work in care homes and staff the NHS, and people tend to want it. But they are good for us is a them and us argument. And so you've got to move to, and liberals shouldn't find it uncomfortable to move to how can people become us? And how do people become us is where if people think that's going well, you will have a depth of confidence and consent to future migration because people feel it's happened in the past, it's happening in the future. That's my fundamental argument. So the America question is a really good counterexample because America was really good at this, the Statue of Liberty, Ellis Island and so on, and yet has ended up in a sort of red versus blue America. So that gives you a counter case where even if people can become American, if there are just two Americas in an existential, and one of my arguments is we should use the word culture war more narrowly. not for any Twitter storm that somebody starts about, you know, an academic this morning and a think tanker tomorrow. But we should use the culture war seriously. It's a kind of analogy to civil war. The democratic society is broken down and people are thinking of getting the guns out because you can't resolve this. It's an existential threat to both sides and you can't disagree well about it. The culture war is a metaphorical version of that can have some violence, I think, underneath it. And that's what's happening, you know, with Trump and January the 6th in the Capitol. So America, I think, has got these two big political tribes, maybe with a Democrat vision of a future America, which maybe looks a bit like a sort of the kind of thing I'm talking about, or Barack Obama would be talking about, and a version of America that doesn't want that and is clashing over that. And if you end up there, then it's going to be really difficult. And to some extent, I think populist arguments are about that. The Brexit argument is a version of that. I think perhaps a narrower one. The politics of Hungary, the politics of Poland, the politics of India are all based on these competing ideas of you know, whose country is it? If you're the liberal inclusive civic version of that debate, whether it's sort of a high temperature moment or a calmer moment, I would always be very loath to give up on the national symbols instead of staking a claim to them. You know, if I'm Donald Tusk addressing a Polish rally, if I'm the Democrats, I'd want to say our version of America is better. It's what Martin Luther King does, is he doesn't say, you know, all of your symbols, all of your constitutions, all your flags, they've always been a lie. He says, uphold your promises. I want the promises to be upheld. It's a very powerful rhetorical, symbolic move if it's authentic and if it's meant. And clearly, for Martin Luther King, Black America meant it. So that is a different kind of challenge, I think. Political polarization. The political polarization is about age, educational status, and things like this. It's not always about who is diverse or who is pro-minority. And you can often get, and you see it in America and you see a bit of it in Britain, you will get settled minorities being champions of the populist argument. That can be a attractive position to take up.
Thank you. I think we're moving towards the close, you know, our scheduled time. I don't know whether anyone's got a question here or online, but if you have, now is the time to indicate. I will let you, Sunder, have the final word yourself. But if there isn't a question, maybe I'll just share a historical observation with you, which is not in itself a question, but something that may still be new to you. A couple of people in the room know this because I've mentioned this at a previous ethnicity seminar. And it's to do with the Commission for Multi-Ethnic Britain and to do with something that you discuss in your book, namely the value and the status that we should give and don't always give to citizenship acquisition ceremonies, the celebration of people who've just acquired British citizenship. So what a lot of people don't know, including the people we were talking about an hour ago from the Telegraph and the Daily Mail and so on, is that amongst the many recommendations that the Tariq report made, one of them was that Britain should have citizenship award ceremonies, as opposed to just send people a foolscap brown envelope telling them that they were now British citizens. And not everybody was totally delighted on the Commission with that proposal, but it clearly was part of our report, so it went through. But what I wanted to remind some people here and to share with you was that actually that suggestion came from me. So not only did a report that's supposed to be really anti-British and wild, radical multiculturalists have a suggestion about celebrating our British citizenship in the way that we weren't doing before. Not only did it include that, though of course the practice only emerged much later after a report by Bernard Crick. but also that someone who is supposed to be a kind of dinosaur multiculturalist like me has actually made that positive suggestion. And one of the reasons that it was important to me is because I have a lot of family in Canada. And so I had seen how Canadians celebrate citizenship, and that people, it really does matter to people. People want a party on the day that they become citizens. They don't just want an anonymous letter in the post. And we all know the United States makes quite a big song and dance about citizenship. So I said at the commission, I said, why do we hate our citizenship so much that we can't allow people to celebrate it? So that's sharing a little bit of history from 23 years ago. Been fascinating listening to your own autobiographical interweaved history of Britain with this optimistic thread running through it. Thank you so much for that. And please feel free now to conclude this seminar in any way that you wish.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I really appreciate the invitation. That's great you did that. And I write about the importance of citizenship ceremonies. I'll send you a little video that you can share with this group. So we brought new and old citizens together in Southampton and Edinburgh, people who've been born British and people who've acquired it. We made them, do the history quiz, etc. And so on. And anyway, the British born group, they tended to think it was a bit of a waste of time. These questions were too difficult, but the New Britons were really thought, the test could be better, but it was actually quite important to know what people thought you should know. And anyway, they also knew the answers to the history quiz, having actually passed it, and so on. And they persuaded very much the British born that it was meaningful to people and therefore should be supported. And then people had views that the practical barriers were bad and the costs were too high and so on. So it was a really interesting point where you could make liberal reforms in that frame. It's been great to talk to you all. I very much appreciate, long academic critiques and, short tweets about the book, recommending it. Another hashtag for the week ahead, hashtag Windrush75. I know there's a lot going on in Bristol, which is an important centre for this, a lot going on across the country. And then there's a quarter of a century left now of this century to work on this autumn and next year. So I hope I'll be back at the, with you again to think about where we go, how we set that vision. So I really appreciate the engagement and the support, and it's been great to talk to you today.
Thank you. Inshallah, you will be back in 25 years' time. Whether I'll be here is perhaps another matter we don't need to go into. Thank you very much, Sunder.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us. This is the last seminar of the academic year. So hope to reconnect with you all next October. Bye-bye. Have a good summer.